Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Listen, if you're ever in the Appalachian Mountains in November and someone asks you to go near a cemetery after dark, RUN. Don't ask why, just run. These 8 people didn't run, they took the job. They needed the money. And what they found, waiting for them in those graves. Subscribe right now, hit like, and share this horror. Drop a comment telling me where you're brave enough to watch from. Turn off your lights. This is gonna get dark. I'm 22 years old and a junior at State College, majoring in elementary education. Like most college students, I'm always strapped for cash, so I picked up a babysitting gig with this family called the Hendricks, who live way up in the mountains about 40 minutes from campus. They've got an 8-year-old daughter named Emma, who's sweet as can be, and they pay me $20 an hour just to watch her a couple evenings a week while they go out. It's easy money, and Emma's usually asleep by 9 anyway, so I can get my studying done. The Hendricks live in this beautiful log house tucked back in the hills, surrounded by nothing but trees and wildlife. Their closest neighbor is probably 2 miles away, down a winding dirt road that barely fits one car. It's the kind of place where you can sit on the porch at night and not hear a single man-made sound, just owls and the wind through the pines. Mrs. Hendricks is a nurse at the county hospital, and Mr. Hendricks works for the Forestry Service, so they know these mountains like the back of their hands. They'd been trying to have another baby for years, and when Mrs. Hendricks finally got pregnant at 38, they were over the moon about it. I'd been babysitting for them since the beginning of the semester, so about 3 months by the time this happened. Emma and I had our routine down pat. I'd get there around 6, we'd eat whatever Mrs. Hendricks had left for dinner, maybe watch a Disney movie or play some board games. Then I'd tuck her in with a story around 8:30. After that, I'd usually spread my textbooks out on their kitchen table and work on assignments until Mr. Hendricks got home to drive me back to campus. He never let me drive myself up there, said the mountain roads were too dangerous at night for someone who didn't know them well. The house itself was this gorgeous 2-story log cabin that Mr. Hendricks's grandfather had built back in the 1942. It had these huge windows that looked out over the valley, and during the day you could see for miles. But at night, those same windows just reflected the inside lights back at you, making it impossible to see what was out there in the darkness. The place was cozy, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel a little isolated sometimes, especially when the wind would pick up and make the trees creak and sway around the house. Emma was one of those kids who was wise beyond her years, probably from spending so much time around adults and living in such a quiet place. She'd tell me stories about the animals she'd see from her bedroom window. Deer, raccoons, sometimes even black bears wandering through their yard. Her parents had taught her to respect the wildlife, but not to fear it, which I thought was pretty cool. She had this little journal where she'd draw pictures of all the different birds and animals she spotted, and she'd get so excited to show me her latest discoveries. November 28th started out like any other babysitting night. Mrs. Hendricks was about 8 months pregnant and getting close to her due date, but the baby wasn't expected for another couple weeks. I showed up at 6 like usual, and everything seemed normal. Mrs. Hendricks looked tired but happy, and she'd made this amazing chicken and rice casserole that smelled incredible. Mr. Hendricks was in his workshop out back, fixing something on his 4-wheeler, and Emma was sprawled on the living room floor working on a puzzle. We had dinner, played a few rounds of Uno, and I was just getting ready to start Emma's bedtime routine when Mrs. Hendricks suddenly doubled over in the kitchen, grabbing the counter and breathing hard. I knew immediately something was wrong. Her face went pale, and she had this panicked look in her eyes. She called for her husband, and when he came running in from outside, she whispered something to him that made his eyes go wide. Emma was asking what was happening, and I was trying to keep her calm while her parents rushed around grabbing bags and car keys. "The baby's coming early," Mrs. Hendricks managed to explain between contractions. "We have to get to the hospital right now." Mr. Hendricks was throwing things into a bag with shaking hands, and you could tell they were both scared because this wasn't how they'd planned it. The nearest hospital was over an hour away on winding mountain roads, and Mrs. Hendricks was clearly in serious labor. They were torn about what to do with Emma. Originally, the plan had been for Emma to stay with Mrs. Hendricks's sister when the baby came, but this was happening so fast that there wasn't time to arrange anything. I told them I could stay the night if they needed me to, that it wasn't a problem at all. Emma was already in her pajamas anyway, and I had my backpack with all my textbooks. Mr. Hendricks looked relieved but also worried about leaving us alone so far from town. Are you sure you'll be okay up here by yourselves? He asked, looking between Emma and me. It might be a long night, and we probably won't be back until tomorrow. I assured him we'd be fine. I'd stayed late plenty of times before, and the house was secure. They had good locks, and the neighbors, even though they were far away, were the kind of people who'd come running if there was any trouble. They rushed out the door around 9:30, leaving me with a list of emergency numbers and $100 on the kitchen counter, just in case. I watched their headlights disappear down the mountain road and turned back to find Emma standing in the doorway, looking a little scared and uncertain about everything that had just happened. I sat down with her and explained that her mom and dad were going to get her new baby brother or sister, and that we were going to have a fun sleepover until they got back. Getting Emma to sleep took longer than usual because she was excited and nervous about the baby, but by 10 o'clock she was finally settled in her room upstairs. I checked all the doors and windows like Mr. Hendricks had taught me, then spread my economics textbook out on the kitchen table and tried to focus on studying for my midterm. The house was quiet except for the old logs settling and the wind outside, sounds I'd gotten used to over the months. Around 10:30, I started thinking about how I was going to get back to campus the next day. Mr. Hendricks had taken their only vehicle, and I didn't have a car, just rode the bus or caught rides with friends. I figured I'd probably have to call someone to come pick me up, but that would be expensive and inconvenient. Then I remembered something Emma had mentioned before. There was a walking path that cut through Hillside Cemetery and came out right near the bus stop in town. She'd said it was way shorter than taking the main road, maybe 30 minutes versus over an hour of walking. I'd seen the cemetery path during the daytime when we'd driven past it. It was this old graveyard that dated back to the 1800s, set on a hill overlooking the valley. The path was well maintained, with these little solar lights marking the way, and it cut right through the middle of the cemetery grounds. Emma had mentioned that she and her dad sometimes walked through there during the day when they were heading to town, and that it was perfectly safe. During daylight, I could see how it would be kind of peaceful. Just old headstones and well-kept grass, with a clear view of the surrounding area. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I could wait until morning and then take the cemetery path down to town to catch the bus back to campus. It would save me having to ask someone to drive all the way up the mountain to get me, and I wouldn't feel guilty about making the Hendricks pay for a taxi. I had my pepper spray in my purse and my phone flashlight, so even if it was still a little dark out, I'd be prepared. Plus, it was supposed to be a clear night with a full moon, so visibility wouldn't be too bad. But around 11 o'clock, I started getting antsy about being alone in the house. It wasn't that I was scared exactly, but the silence was getting to me in a way it never had before. Usually, Mr. Hendricks would be back by then, and I'd be heading home. The house felt different when I knew I was really and truly alone with just Emma sleeping upstairs. Every little sound seemed amplified, the refrigerator humming, the heater clicking on, boards creaking as the temperature dropped outside. I decided to check on Emma around 11:30, just to make myself feel better. I crept upstairs and peeked into her room, where she was fast asleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She looked so peaceful and small in her twin bed, and for a moment I felt this surge of protectiveness toward her. I was responsible for keeping her safe until her parents got back, and that felt like a big responsibility given how isolated we were. Standing at her bedroom window, I could see the cemetery in the distance. The solar lights along the path were clearly visible, tiny dots of white light marking the route through the darkness. It actually looked kind of pretty from up there, like a string of pearls laid across the hillside. The full moon was bright enough that I could make out the general shape of the cemetery grounds and even some of the larger headstones. It really didn't look scary at all, just peaceful and well-maintained. I made myself a cup of tea and tried to get back to studying, but I kept thinking about the walk. The practical part of me knew it made sense to take the shortcut, especially since the weather was clear and I'd be walking on a maintained path with lighting. I'd walked through plenty of cemeteries during the day, and they'd never bothered me. Dead people weren't the ones you had to worry about. It was the living ones that could cause trouble. And there wasn't likely to be anyone else wandering around a mountaintop cemetery at dawn. By midnight, I'd pretty much convinced myself that taking the cemetery path was the smart choice. I even looked up the route on my phone and confirmed that it would cut my walk from about an hour and 20 minutes down to maybe 35 or 40 minutes. That was a significant difference, especially if I was going to be carrying my heavy backpack full of textbooks. I decided I'd get a few hours of sleep on the couch and then head out around 5:30 in the morning, which would get me to the bus stop with plenty of time to spare. I dozed off and on for a few hours, but around 4 a.m. I woke up feeling restless and decided I might as well get moving. Emma was still sleeping soundly, and I left a note explaining where I'd gone and saying I'd call to check on her once I got to town. I gathered up my things, made sure the house was secure, and stepped out into the cold November morning. The temperature had dropped significantly overnight, and my breath came out in little puffs as I walked down their driveway. The stars were incredibly bright, and the full moon cast everything in this silvery light that made the whole landscape look almost magical. I could hear my footsteps crunching on the gravel road, but otherwise it was completely silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. It was the kind of quiet that felt almost unnatural. The walk to the cemetery entrance took about 15 minutes, and I was feeling pretty good about my decision. The path was clearly marked, and the solar lights were working perfectly, creating a well-lit route through the darkness. The cemetery gate was open, which I figured meant it was okay for pedestrians to use the path. There was even a small sign that mentioned the walking trail, confirming that it was an official route. As I entered the cemetery, I noticed how peaceful everything felt. The headstones were mostly old but well-maintained, and the grass had been recently mowed. Some of the graves had fresh flowers or small decorations, which made the place feel cared for rather than abandoned. The path wound between the older sections and the newer ones, marked with those solar lights every 20 feet or so. It really wasn't creepy at all, just quiet and dignified. I'd made it maybe halfway through the cemetery when I first heard something that made me pause. It sounded like branches breaking somewhere off to my right, in the section where the trees grew closer to the path. At first I figured it was just a deer or some other animal moving through the woods. These mountains were full of wildlife, and it made sense that animals would be more active in the early morning hours when it was cooler and quieter. But then I heard it again, and this time it sounded different. The branches were breaking in a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be random animal movement. It was like something large was moving parallel to the path, staying in the trees, but following my route. I stopped walking and listened, trying to figure out what it might be. The sound stopped too, which struck me as odd. A deer wouldn't necessarily stop moving just because I had stopped walking. I started moving again, keeping my ears open, and after a few seconds, I heard the footsteps resume. They weren't quite matching my pace. Sometimes they'd get ahead of me, sometimes they'd fall behind, but they were definitely there. Deep, heavy steps that sounded too big to be a person, but too deliberate to be an animal just wandering around. Whatever it was seemed to be staying about 30 or 40 feet away from the path, keeping to the darker areas between the trees. That's when I started to get nervous. I picked up my pace a little, thinking that maybe if I moved faster, whatever it was would lose interest and wander away. But the footsteps picked up too, staying with me as I hurried along the lighted path. I could feel my heart starting to beat faster, and I reached into my purse to get my pepper spray ready, just in case. Then I heard breathing, not just from one direction, but from multiple places around me. It was this deep, raspy sound, like air being forced through damaged lungs or a throat that wasn't quite right. The breathing was coming from my left, my right, and even from behind me, like I was being surrounded by things that were struggling to breathe properly. The sound was horrible, wet and labored, and definitely not human. I realized then that there was more than one of whatever these things were, and they were coordinating their movements. They were staying hidden in the shadows between the solar lights, but they were definitely hurting me, blocking off my escape routes while keeping me moving forward along the path. I thought about turning around and running back the way I'd come, but when I looked behind me, I could see shapes moving between the headstones, cutting off my retreat. That's when I heard Emma's voice calling from deeper in the cemetery. "Ashley, help me. Something's chasing me." My blood went cold. Emma was safe at home in her bed. I'd checked on her before I left, and I'd locked the house behind me. There was no way she could be out here in the cemetery. But the voice was definitely hers, clear and terrified and crying for help. It was coming from the older section of the cemetery, toward the back where the trees grew thicker and the solar lights were spaced farther apart. "I'm hiding. Please find me before they catch me." Every logical part of my brain was screaming that this was wrong, that Emma couldn't possibly be here, that this had to be some kind of trick. But hearing her voice, so scared and desperate, made it almost impossible to think straight. What if somehow she had followed me? What if she'd woken up and tried to catch up with me and gotten lost? The thought of her being out here alone with whatever these things were made, my chest tight with panic. Against every instinct I had, I left the main path and followed the sound of Emma's voice toward the older section of the cemetery. My phone flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating weathered headstones and overgrown graves that looked like they hadn't been tended in decades. The breathing sounds were getting closer, coming from all around me now, but I kept moving toward where I'd heard Emma calling. Then I found the footprints. Small shoe prints in the soft dirt between the graves, definitely made by a child's sneakers. They looked exactly like the ones Emma had been wearing the night before, little purple Converse with star patterns on the sides. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the damp earth, leading deeper into the cemetery toward a section where old mausoleums and larger monuments cast heavy shadows even in the moonlight. I followed the prints, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The breathing sounds were getting louder and closer, and I could hear movement in the trees above me, like something was leaping from branch to branch, keeping pace with me as I stumbled through the graves. Emma's voice called out again, closer now, coming from the direction of an old stone mausoleum that stood at the back of the cemetery. "In here. I'm hiding in here." The mausoleum was one of those old family burial chambers, probably built in the early 1900s when wealthy families could afford private crypts. The door was standing open, which seemed wrong. Those doors were usually locked or sealed shut. But Emma's voice was definitely coming from inside, and I could see a small figure crouched in the corner when I shined my flashlight through the doorway. "They made me wait for you," the figure said in Emma's voice. But something was wrong with the way she was sitting. Her head was tilted at an odd angle, and when my flashlight beam hit her eyes, they reflected the light back like an animal's, bright and unnatural in the darkness. "They said you'd come if they used my face." That's when I saw the other things behind her in the mausoleum. They were pale and elongated, like human bodies that had been stretched wrong. Their limbs were too long, with joints that bent in places where joints shouldn't be. They moved like spiders, quick and skittering, positioning themselves around the Emma thing as it smiled at me with a mouth that opened wider than any human mouth should be able to open. "We've been so hungry," it said, and the voice that came out wasn't Emma's anymore. It was something old and inhuman, layered with harmonics that made my teeth ache. So very, very hungry. I ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through the cemetery with those things pouring out of the mausoleum behind me. They moved with this horrible clicking sound, like insects, and I could hear them in the trees above me, leaping from branch to branch with wet, slapping sounds. They were fast, impossibly fast, and they seemed to be everywhere at once, surrounding me as I desperately tried to find my way back to the main path. I could hear them breathing right behind me, that awful raspy sound, and I knew that if I tripped or slowed down even a little bit, they'd be on me. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but terror kept me moving. I crashed through headstones and monuments, following the glow of the solar lights that marked the way back to the cemetery entrance. Just as I felt something grab at my jacket, I burst through the cemetery gates and onto the main road. The moment my feet hit the pavement outside the cemetery grounds, the sounds stopped. The clicking, the breathing, the movement in the trees, everything went silent. I turned around and saw them clustered at the boundary, these pale, wrong shapes pressed up against an invisible barrier that seemed to keep them trapped within the cemetery limits. They stood there watching me, swaying slightly, making soft clicking noises like they were frustrated. The Emma thing was in front, still wearing her face, but wrong, so wrong, with those reflective eyes and that too wide mouth. It raised one hand and waved at me, a gesture that would have been innocent if not for the way its arm bent in 3 places, where an arm should only bend in one. I didn't stop running until I reached the bus stop in town, where I collapsed on the bench and called 911. The police thought I was having some kind of breakdown when I tried to explain what had happened. They drove up to check on Emma and found her safe in her bed, exactly where I'd left her. The house was still locked up tight, and there was no sign that anyone had been inside. When I called the hospital to check on the Hendricks, I learned that Mrs. Hendricks had given birth to a healthy baby boy around 3 a.m. Emma was fine, the baby was fine, everyone was fine. Except me. The next day, I drove back up to the cemetery with 2 of my friends, just to prove to myself that what I'd seen wasn't real. In the daylight, it looked exactly like what it was, a peaceful, well-maintained cemetery with a walking path. But when we got to the mausoleum, where I'd seen the Emma thing, we found something that made my blood run cold. Child-sized footprints leading away from the mausoleum, heading toward the cemetery boundary. But these prints didn't stop at the gates. They continued past the cemetery, down the mountain road, and split off toward every house in the area. Little purple Converse prints with star patterns, pressed into the soft dirt beside driveways and front porches, like someone had been testing doors and looking in windows. I quit babysitting for the Hendricks after that. I couldn't look at Emma without wondering if it was really her or if it was one of those things wearing her face. I know that sounds crazy, but you have to understand, those creatures had copied her perfectly. Her voice, her mannerisms, even her shoes. How could I ever be sure it was really her? I moved back closer to campus and found a job at the library instead. Safer, quieter, no isolated mountain houses or walking through cemeteries in the dark. But sometimes, late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of someone I know in my peripheral vision. A classmate, a friend, a professor, and for just a second, I'll wonder if it's really them or if it's something else wearing their face. Because now I check every shadow twice, never knowing whose face they might wear next. And I never, ever take shortcuts through cemeteries anymore, no matter how well lit the path might be. I'm 31 years old, and I've been delivering pizza for Tony's Pizza Palace for about 2 years now. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills, and I know every back road in 3 counties around here. My girlfriend Sarah keeps telling me I should find something better, maybe go back to school, but honestly, the freedom of being on the road beats sitting in some office cubicle. Plus, the tips aren't bad if you're willing to drive out to the more remote places where other drivers won't go. I live in a small town in eastern Kentucky, where the mountains roll on forever, and half the addresses don't show up on GPS. Most of the pizza places here won't deliver past the main roads, but Tony's got a reputation for going anywhere as long as you pay up front. That's how we stay competitive with the chain places. I've driven up logging roads, dirt paths that barely qualify as driveways, even hiked the last quarter mile to someone's cabin with a hot bag slung over my shoulder. The locals appreciate it, and they tip accordingly. My route usually covers about a 50-mile radius, taking me deep into coal country and up into the hollers where some families have been living for generations. I've delivered to old-timers who remember when the mines were still running, young families trying to make it on disability checks, and weekend warriors from Louisville who bought cheap land for hunting cabins. Most people are decent folk, just trying to get by. They order pizza on Friday nights when they get paid, or for their kids' birthday parties, or sometimes just because they're tired and don't want to cook. The dispatcher, Maria, always saved the mountain runs for me because I had 4-wheel drive and wasn't afraid of narrow roads. Some of the other drivers would complain about GPS cutting out or getting lost, but I'd been doing this long enough that I could navigate by landmarks. Old barn with the collapsed roof meant turn left at the next fork. Rusty bridge over Miller's Creek meant you were halfway to the Hendricks place. Big oak tree with the tire swing meant the McCoy family was just around the bend. I knew the rhythm of these mountains, like most people know their neighborhood streets. During the day, you'd see kids playing in the yards, dogs running loose, old men sitting on porches, watching the world go by. At night, most folks went to bed early. The mountain roads got quiet except for the occasional coal truck heading down to the interstate. It was peaceful, in its own way. Made me feel connected to something older than the fast food chains and strip malls down in town. That all changed on November 23rd, the night before Thanksgiving. Most places were closed early, but Tony stayed open until midnight to catch the last-minute orders from people getting ready for family gatherings. Around 11:30 p.m., just when I was thinking about heading home, Maria flagged me down at the counter. "Got one more for you, Jake," she said, handing me the receipt. Way up in the mountains, but they paid with a credit card and left a $20 tip. I looked at the address and didn't recognize it, which was unusual. After 2 years of deliveries, I thought I knew every house number in my coverage area. The GPS showed it as being about 30 miles up Route 421, then another 10 miles on some road I'd never heard of called Reunion Ridge Drive. The order was substantial too. 2 large pepperoni pizzas, garlic bread, and a 2-liter of Coke. With the tip included, it was worth the drive even if it took me an hour round trip. Morrison family, I said, reading the name on the order. Don't think I've delivered to them before. First-time customers, Maria shrugged. Money's good, and you know these mountain folk appreciate the service. I loaded up the pizza bags in my Honda CR-V and headed out into the night. A thick fog had rolled in during the evening, the kind that clings to the mountainsides and turns your headlights into a useless glare. November fog in these mountains could be treacherous. It would bank up in the valleys and make roads disappear completely. But I'd driven in worse conditions, and the heater was working good, so I figured I'd take it slow and careful. Route 421 wound up into the higher elevations, past the old Baptist church and the abandoned gas station that had been closed since the coal company pulled out. The fog got thicker as I climbed, and I had to drop my speed down to about 25 miles per hour just to see the yellow lines on the asphalt. My phone showed full signal at first, then dropped to 3 bars, then 2. After about 40 minutes of climbing, my GPS started acting up. The screen would show my location for a few seconds, then display searching for signal before going back to the map. Then it would say, recalculating route, and try to redirect me back the way I'd come. I'd dealt with spotty GPS coverage before in these mountains, so I kept following the road signs and my general sense of direction. The turnoff for Reunion Ridge Drive was marked by a wooden sign that looked handmade, the kind of rustic lettering you'd see at a state park. The road was paved but narrow, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. My headlights cut through the fog in weak cones, illuminating the pine trees that pressed close to both sides of the asphalt. There were no mailboxes, no driveways, no signs of human habitation at all. I drove for what felt like another 20 minutes, checking my odometer and trying to estimate distance. The road kept winding higher, switchbacking up the mountainside in a series of tight curves. My ears were popping from the elevation gain. The fog was so dense now that I could barely see 10 feet ahead of my bumper. I was starting to worry about finding a place to turn around if I got lost. Then I saw lights ahead through the fog. At first it was just a glow, like the security lights around a farmhouse or maybe a gas station. As I got closer, I could make out what looked like a parking area with several cars. My GPS had gone completely dark by this point, and my phone showed no signal at all, but I figured I'd finally found the Morrison place. I pulled into what appeared to be a gravel parking lot and turned off my engine. That's when I realized where I was. It wasn't a house or a business. I was sitting in the middle of a cemetery. The lights I'd seen were old-fashioned lampposts scattered throughout the graveyard, casting yellow pools of illumination through the fog. And the cars, there had to be at least 50 of them, maybe more, parked in neat rows between the headstones like it was some kind of massive outdoor gathering. But these weren't normal cars. Mixed in with a few modern SUVs and pickup trucks, I could see vehicles from every era you could imagine. A 1952 Buick with tail fins and chrome bumpers, a muscle car from the 70s with racing stripes, what looked like a Model T Ford, even an old horse-drawn wagon with wooden wheels. All of them were arranged in perfect rows, like someone had organized a car show in a cemetery at midnight in the middle of a November fog. I sat in my car for a minute, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Through the fog, I could make out people moving around between the graves. Families, it looked like. I could see blankets spread on the ground, groups of people sitting together, children running between the headstones. It looked exactly like a family reunion picnic, except it was happening at midnight in a graveyard during a fog so thick you could barely breathe. I grabbed the pizza bags and got out of my car. The air was cold and damp, with that particular chill you get from fog mixed with mountain elevation. I could hear voices, people talking and laughing, kids playing, but the sound seemed muffled and distant, like they were coming from underwater. "Pizza delivery," I called out, checking the receipt again. "Looking for the Morrison family." An elderly man emerged from the nearest group, walking toward me with a warm smile. He was wearing a dark suit that looked expensive but old-fashioned, like something from a formal event decades ago. His hair was white and neatly combed, and his face had the kind of deep lines that come from spending a lifetime outdoors. "That's us, son," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming all the way up here. I know it's quite a drive." His handshake was firm, but his skin felt cold, like he'd been standing outside for hours. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a wad of bills, counting out exact change plus the $20 tip. The money felt strange in my hands. The bills were soft, almost like fabric, and they had an odd smell to them, like they'd been stored in an attic for decades. "Hope you didn't have any trouble finding us," he said. "Roads can be tricky up here when the fog rolls in." I looked around at the gatherings spread throughout the cemetery. Now that I was closer, I could see more details. There were people of all ages: elderly couples, middle-aged families, teenagers, small children. They had blankets and folding chairs set up on and around the graves, like they were having a massive family picnic. Some were playing cards by lamplight, others were sharing food from baskets and coolers. Kids were running tag games between the headstones, their laughter echoing through the fog. But something was wrong with the whole scene. For one thing, nobody seemed to be affected by the cold. It was November at high elevation with thick fog, probably in the 40s, and most of these people were dressed in light clothing, sundresses, short sleeves, clothes you'd wear to a summer gathering. The children were running around barefoot in the wet grass. For another thing, their movements seemed slow and deliberate, like they were underwater or moving through thick syrup. When they turned to look at me, their heads moved in these strange, fluid motions that didn't look quite right. And their faces. Everyone was smiling and appeared to be having a wonderful time, but their skin was too pale, almost translucent in the lamplight. Their eyes reflected the light in a way that human eyes shouldn't, giving off a subtle glow like an animal's eyes caught in headlights. "Why don't you stay and eat with us?" the elderly man said, gesturing toward his family group. "We're having our annual family reunion. Haven't seen each other in ages." I looked over at where he was pointing and saw a large group of people sitting on blankets around several graves. They had plates and cups spread out like a picnic, but when I looked more carefully, I realized the plates were empty. They were going through all the motions of eating and drinking, bringing forks to their mouths, tilting cups to their lips, passing dishes around, but there wasn't any actual food there. They were pantomiming a meal. "Thanks for the offer," I said, backing toward my car. "But I need to get back. Long drive down the mountain." "Oh, you can't leave yet," the old man said, and his smile got a little wider. "Roads washed out behind you. Happens every November when we have our gathering. Don't worry though, cars always find their way back to the parking area eventually." I turned to look at where I'd left my Honda and felt my stomach drop. The car was gone. Just empty space where I'd parked it 5 minutes earlier. I looked around frantically and spotted it sitting 3 rows over, wedged between what looked like a hearse from the 1932nd and a rusted-out pickup truck that was probably older than I was. I was absolutely certain I'd parked near the entrance to the cemetery. There was no way my car had moved on its own, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone drive it. But there it sat, like it had been part of this strange automotive collection all along. "How did my car get over there?" I asked, but the old man just shrugged. "Like I said, happens every November. Cars just seem to find their proper places during our reunion. Nothing to worry about." The panic was starting to set in now. I began walking quickly toward where my car was parked, weaving between the rows of vehicles and graves. As I passed the family groups, they all called out to me in friendly voices. "Stay for dinner." "Young man, we've got plenty of food. Haven't had a visitor in so long." I forgot that. You must be hungry after that drive. But when I glanced at their picnic setups, I saw the same thing everywhere. Empty plates, empty cups, empty serving dishes. Entire families sitting in circles, having animated conversations and sharing meals that didn't exist. They would reach for sandwiches that weren't there, pour drinks from empty pitchers, offer me bites of food from vacant plates. That's when it really hit me. Everyone at this reunion, every single person I could see in the fog-shrouded cemetery, was dead. Had been dead for decades, maybe longer. The old-fashioned clothes, the antique cars, the way they moved like they were underwater. This wasn't a family gathering. This was something else entirely. I reached my car and fumbled for my keys, hands shaking from adrenaline and cold. The Honda's engine turned over but died immediately. I tried again, same thing. The starter would catch and the engine would sputter to life, then die after a few seconds, like someone had turned off the fuel. Through my windshield, I could see faces pressing against the glass. 3 generations of the Morrison family, all looking at me with those pale, glowing eyes and 2 wide smiles. Grandparents, parents, children, even what looked like a baby being held by a woman in a dress from the 1000 doll, 940 seconds. They surrounded the car completely, but they weren't threatening or angry. They looked hungry, but not for food. Hungry for something else. Just stay one night, I could hear them saying through the glass, their voices muffled but persistent. We have so much to talk about. Been so long since we had company. Stay and tell us about the world down there. What's it like now? What year is it? We lose track of time up here. I kept trying the ignition, pumping the gas pedal, and praying to whatever gods watch over pizza delivery drivers lost in supernatural fog. The engine would catch for a moment, giving me hope, then die again. Outside the windows, more faces appeared. Dozens of Morrison family members from across the decades, all wanting me to stay for their eternal reunion. On my 7th or 8th try, the engine finally caught and stayed running. I didn't waste time letting it warm up. I threw the Honda in reverse and backed out fast, scattering the crowd of dead relatives who stepped aside with disappointed expressions, like I was being rude for leaving their party early. They didn't chase me or try to stop the car. They just stood there in the fog and lamplight, waving goodbye like normal people seeing off a visitor. In my rearview mirror, I could see them returning to their empty picnics and phantom meals, resuming their endless family reunion. The fog seemed to lift as I drove back down Reunion Ridge Drive, or maybe my eyes were just adjusting better to the darkness. My GPS flickered back to life once I'd put about 5 miles between myself and that cemetery, showing that I'd somehow been driving in circles for over 3 hours in the same general area. According to the map, I'd never left a 2-mile radius around the graveyard, even though I'd felt like I'd been driving straight roads the whole time. When I got back to Tony's Pizza Palace, Maria had already gone home and the night shift guy was cleaning up. I told him I'd delivered the order and left it at that. The next day, when I checked our delivery records, there was no listing for any Morrison family order, no credit card transaction, no address on Reunion Ridge Drive. According to our system, I'd been scheduled to go home at 11:30 p.m. the night before. The money from the tip was still in my wallet, though. When I pulled it out in the daylight, I saw that every bill was from the 1,860 seconds, Confederate currency that hadn't been legal tender for over a century. I kept those bills in a drawer at home for a long time before finally throwing them away. Looking at them too long gave me the creeps. I still work for Tony's Pizza Palace, but I don't take the mountain runs anymore. When Maria tries to give me deliveries that go more than 10 miles outside town, I pass them off to other drivers. Some of them think I'm getting soft, afraid of a little fog and narrow roads. Let them think that. I've never driven up Route 421 again, and I never will. Sometimes on November nights when the fog rolls in thick, I think about that cemetery and wonder if the Morrison family is still having their reunion. Wonder if they're still waiting for someone to stay and eat with them, to tell them about the world they left behind. I hope they find peace someday, but I also hope they find it without me. I'm 43 years old, and I've been working as a janitor at Riverside Elementary for 18 years now. It's honest work, you know? I take pride in keeping those hallways clean, making sure the kids have a good environment to learn in. But about a year and a half ago, my daughter Emma got diagnosed with some rare blood disorder that required all these expensive treatments. Insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough. That's when I started looking for extra work. The cemetery job seemed like a godsend when I found it. Willowbrook Cemetery was looking for someone to do overnight maintenance, just basic groundskeeping stuff, trash pickup, leaf clearing, $200 cash every week for maybe 5 hours of work, Tuesday and Friday nights. The manager, this older guy named Mr. Henley, said it had to be done at night because of insurance regulations or something. Didn't matter to me. I needed that money, and night work meant I could still do my day job at the school. Willowbrook sits on these rolling hills, about 15 minutes outside town, maybe 300 graves spread across the property. It's one of those old cemeteries, where some of the headstones date back to the 1800s, all weathered limestone and crumbling marble. During the day, it's actually pretty peaceful. Lots of old oak trees, well-maintained grass, the kind of place you might take a walk if you didn't mind being around the dead. At night, though, it had a different feel to it. Quieter than quiet, if that makes sense. Like the whole place was holding its breath. Mr. Henley gave me a full set of keys on my first night, keys to the maintenance shed, the front gate, even the little chapel they used for services. "You're on your own out here," he told me, which suited me fine. I'd always been more comfortable working alone anyway. The job was simple enough. Empty the trash bins scattered around the grounds, rake up leaves during fall season, pick up any debris that had blown in during the day. Most nights I'd start around 10 p.m. and be done by 3 in the morning, sometimes earlier if the weather had been calm. Those first 2 months went smooth as anything. I'd drive out there in my old Ford pickup, unlock the gate, and spend a few hours just walking the grounds with my rake and trash bags. The work was easy, almost meditative. There's something about being outside at night, just you and the stars, that puts things in perspective. I'd think about Emma, about how this extra money was helping pay for her treatments, and it made the whole thing feel worthwhile. The cemetery itself was well kept, probably better maintained than some of the parks in town. Mr. Henley clearly took pride in the place, and it showed. The grass was always trimmed neat, the pathways were clear, and even the older sections had been restored with care. I started learning the layout pretty quickly, where the oldest graves were clustered near the chapel, where the newer sections stretched toward the back property line, which areas got the most foot traffic from visitors during the day. But there were things I noticed that struck me as odd, even early on. Some of the graves had these perfect circles of dead grass around them, maybe 6 feet in diameter, like someone had been walking the same path over and over until they'd worn the ground bare. At first I figured it might be family members who visited regularly, pacing while they grieved or something like that. But the circles were too perfect, too uniform. And they were always around the same graves, maybe a dozen scattered throughout the cemetery. No real pattern to which ones. When I asked Mr. Henley about it during my second week, he just shrugged and said it was probably chemical runoff from old embalming practices. Some of those graves go back over a century, he explained. Who knows what kind of preservatives they were using back then? Probably leaching into the soil and killing the grass. Made sense? I suppose, though I'd never seen anything quite like it before. The maintenance shed was where I kept all my supplies: rakes, trash bags, a leaf blower for the bigger jobs. It was a small building, maybe 10 by 12 feet, tucked away behind the chapel where visitors wouldn't see it. Mr. Henley had been very specific about keeping it locked when I wasn't using it. "Insurance again," he'd said, handing me the key. "Can't have people wandering around unsupervised." The shed was pretty basic inside, some shelving along the walls, hooks for hanging tools, a small workbench in the back corner. November was when everything changed. I remember the date exactly because it was November 12th, a Friday night, and Emma had just finished another round of treatments earlier that week. The doctors were optimistic about her progress, which had put me in a good mood as I drove out to Willowbrook that night. It was cold, probably in the low 40s, and the wind was picking up, sending leaves skittering across the pathways. I figured it would be a busy night for cleanup. I went to unlock the maintenance shed like always, but the door swung open before I could even put the key in the lock. That stopped me cold. I was sure I'd locked it after my last shift on Tuesday night. I always double-checked the lock because Mr. Henley had been so insistent about security. But there it was, hanging open like someone had just walked away and forgotten to close it behind them. I pushed the door wider and stepped inside, flicking on the overhead light. That's when I saw the tools laid out on the workbench, tools I'd never seen before and definitely hadn't left there. They were arranged in a neat row, like someone had been cleaning them and set them out to dry. Long metal hooks with curved ends, some kind of narrow spade or digging tool, and what looked like surgical instruments, curved blades and probes that had no business being in a cemetery maintenance shed. The strangest thing was that they all looked used. There was a dark stain on most of them, dried and flaky like old blood, and when I reached out to touch one of the hooks, it was warm. Not just room temperature, but actually warm, like it had been sitting in sunlight all day. Which was impossible, because the shed didn't have any windows, and I'd turned the light off when I left on Tuesday night. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring at these tools and trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The logical part of my brain was running through possibilities. Maybe Mr. Henley had been doing some maintenance work and forgot to lock up. Maybe there was some kind of restoration project I didn't know about. But none of that explained why the tools were warm, or why they looked so much like surgical instruments instead of groundskeeping equipment. I decided to ask Mr. Henley about it when I saw him next, but for the moment I just wanted to get my regular tools and finish my shift. I grabbed my rake and trash bags from their usual spot, locked the shed behind me, and headed out to start my rounds. The wind was really picking up now, and I could hear it whistling through the oak trees as I walked the pathways. That's when I found the holes. They were scattered throughout the cemetery, maybe a dozen of them that I could see in the light from my flashlight. At first I thought they might be gopher holes or something like that, but when I got closer I realized they were much bigger, maybe 8 inches across and perfectly round. I knelt down next to one of them and shined my light into it, but I couldn't see the bottom. The sides were smooth, like they'd been bored out with some kind of machine, and there was a strange smell coming up from the depths, sharp and chemical, like chlorine mixed with something metallic. The really weird thing was that these holes weren't dug from above. The soil around each one was undisturbed except for the hole itself, like something had punched up through the ground from underneath. I walked around the cemetery and found more of them, some near the graves with the dead grass circles, some in completely random spots. All of them were the same size, same smooth-sided construction, same strange smell drifting up from the darkness below. I called Mr. Henley's number from my cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message about possible sinkhole problems on the property and said I thought he should take a look when he had a chance. Then I spent the rest of the night filling in the holes with loose soil and dead leaves, figuring that was the safest thing to do until someone could figure out what was causing them. When I talked to Mr. Henley the next week, he didn't seem particularly concerned. Happens sometimes when the ground settles, he told me over the phone. Old cemetery like this, there's been a lot of digging over the years. Sometimes the soil just shifts and creates little sinkholes. Just fill them in when you find them, Bobby. Nothing to worry about. But I was worried, especially when the holes came back. The following Friday night, November 19th, I found fresh holes in exactly the same spots I'd filled the week before, plus several new ones. Same smooth sides, same chemical smell, same appearance of having been punched up from below. This time, though, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Digging sounds, coming from underneath the ground. It was around midnight when I first noticed it, a deep scraping noise, like metal on stone, echoing up from somewhere below the cemetery. I stopped what I was doing and listened, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The sound would start and stop randomly, sometimes lasting for 30 seconds, sometimes just a quick scratch, and then silence. It seemed to be moving around, shifting from one part of the cemetery to another. I followed the sound across the grounds, stepping carefully between the headstones and trying not to think about what might be causing it. The noise led me to a section near the back of the property where some of the oldest graves were located. That's where I found a hole so fresh that dirt was still falling into it from the edges. I could see the walls clearly in my flashlight beam, and what I saw made me take a step back. There were scratches along the sides, long, parallel gouges that looked like they'd been made by claws. But these weren't random scratches. They formed patterns, almost like writing, spiraling down into the darkness. I couldn't read them, couldn't even tell if they were supposed to be letters or symbols, but there was definitely an intentional design to them. That's when the smell hit me full force. That same chemical odor I'd noticed before, but stronger now, mixed with something else, something rotten and organic that made my stomach turn. I backed away from the hole, and that's when I saw it. Movement behind one of the larger monuments, maybe 30 feet away, something pale and tall, watching me from the shadows. At first I thought it might be a person, maybe someone visiting a grave late at night, though that would have been strange enough. But as I moved my flashlight in that direction, I got a better look at whatever was standing there, and I knew immediately that it wasn't human. It was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms hung too low, almost to its knees, and the body was unnaturally thin, like someone had stretched a normal person until they were twice their natural height. The skin was gray-white and seemed to have a faint shimmer to it, like it was wet or covered in some kind of mucus. But the face was the worst part. It was mostly human, 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, but the mouth was stretched too wide, extending almost to where the ears should be. And when it opened slightly, I could see rows of needle-sharp teeth, too many of them, all pointing inward like they were designed to grip rather than bite. The thing tilted its head when it realized I was looking at it, and I heard a sound like grinding metal come from its throat. Not a voice, exactly, but some kind of communication. It started moving toward me, and that's when I noticed how wrong its movement was. The joints seemed to bend in directions they shouldn't, and its feet made no sound at all on the gravel pathway. I could see its hands clearly now, fingers that ended in curved claws about 6 inches long, stained dark with the same substance I'd seen on the tools in the maintenance shed. The claws caught the light from my flashlight and seemed to gleam like polished metal. I started backing toward my truck, trying not to make any sudden movements, never taking my eyes off the creature. It followed me step for step, moving in that jerky, unnatural way, its head tilted at an angle that would have broken a human neck. When I was maybe 20 feet from my truck, it spoke. The voice was like breaking glass, sharp and painful to hear, but the words were clear enough. "You've been cleaning up after us. We appreciate the help." That's when I realized there were more of them. They started rising from the fresh holes I'd been staring into, pulling themselves up with those terrible claws, emerging from the ground like some kind of nightmare harvest. 6 of them, all with that same pale, wrong appearance, all with claws stained dark from whatever they'd been doing down in the tunnels beneath the cemetery. They arranged themselves in a loose circle around my truck, not threatening exactly, but definitely blocking my escape routes. Up close, I could see that their skin wasn't just gray. It had a texture like old leather, with patches that looked almost scaled. And the smell coming off them was overwhelming. That same chemical rot I'd been smelling from the holes. One of them, slightly taller than the others, spoke in that same glass-breaking voice. "We've been digging for so long, looking for the old bones, the ones that remember." I didn't wait to hear any more. I dove into my truck, started the engine, and floored the gas pedal, scattering gravel as I tore across the cemetery lawn toward the front gate. In my rearview mirror, I could see them standing there watching me go, perfectly still like statues, their pale forms visible in the red glow of my taillights. I didn't stop driving until I reached my house. And I didn't sleep that night at all. I called Mr. Henley first thing Saturday morning and told him I was quitting, that I couldn't work at the cemetery anymore. I expected him to ask questions, maybe try to talk me out of it, but he just sighed like he'd been expecting the call. "They always get restless when someone new starts working nights," he said quietly. "What are they digging for?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. There was a long pause before he responded. "Something that was buried here long before we started burying people. This land has a history, Bobby. The cemetery is just the most recent chapter." After I hung up, I did some research at the library, looking into the history of the land where Willowbrook Cemetery sits. What I found didn't make me feel any better. The area had been a Cherokee burial ground until 1823, when it was disturbed during a land dispute. The records were vague about what exactly happened, but dozens of graves had been dug up, and the remains relocated to make way for farming. I never went back to Willowbrook Cemetery, not even to drive past it. I found other ways to make the extra money for Emma's treatments, picked up weekend shifts at the school, did some handyman work for neighbors. It took longer to save up what we needed, but we managed. Emma's doing well now, by the way. The treatments worked, and she's been in remission for over a year. Sometimes I wonder if those things under the cemetery had something to do with it, if there was some kind of trade involved that I don't understand. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all. What I do think about, though, especially on nights when the wind is blowing hard and I can hear things scratching around outside, is that they're still down there, still digging through the tunnels beneath those old graves, still looking for whatever it is they lost when the burial ground was disturbed almost 2 centuries ago. And I think about Mr. Henley, who clearly knew what was down there and kept hiring people anyway. I wonder how many night groundskeepers he's been through over the years, and whether any of them stayed longer than I did. I drive a different route to work now, one that doesn't take me anywhere near Willowbrook Cemetery. It adds 10 minutes to my commute, but some detours are worth making. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was that those things were more interested in their digging than in me. But I also know that luck doesn't last forever, especially when you're dealing with something that's been waiting underground for almost 200 years. To this day, I still check my locks twice before going to bed. And I never, ever work nights anymore. I was 22 when this happened, just trying to make it through my junior year at the state college without drowning in debt. I'd been babysitting for the Hendricks family up in the mountains for about 6 months by then, mostly weekends when they needed a night out. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid decent money, and their 8-year-old daughter Emma was sweet as pie. The extra cash helped cover my textbooks and kept ramen noodles from being my only food group. The Hendricks lived way up in the hills, maybe 20 minutes outside town if you took the winding mountain roads. Their closest neighbor was at least 2 miles away, which made their place feel pretty isolated, especially at night. But I'd grown up around these mountains my whole life, so the quiet didn't bother me much. If anything, it was peaceful compared to the chaos of campus life and my cramped dorm room. Mr. and Mrs. Hendricks were good people. He worked construction, she taught at the elementary school in town. They'd been trying for a second baby for years, and Mrs. Hendricks was finally pregnant again, due sometime in early December. She'd been having a rough time with this pregnancy, lots of bed rest and doctor visits, which is why they needed me more often lately. Emma was old enough to mostly take care of herself, but they didn't want to leave her alone while her mom was feeling so poorly. November 28th started out like any other babysitting night. I'd driven up after my last class, got there around 6 when Mr. Hendricks was getting home from work. Mrs. Hendricks was already in her pajamas, looking tired but excited about their date night, first one they'd had in months. They were planning to go to dinner at that Italian place in town, maybe catch a late movie if she was feeling up to it. Emma and I had our usual routine planned. Homework first, then we'd make some popcorn and watch whatever Disney movie she picked out. The evening went perfectly normal. Emma finished her math homework while I helped her with a book report on some story about a brave little mouse. We made grilled cheese for dinner and watched Moana, which I'd probably seen 15 times by then but didn't mind watching again. Emma was in bed by 8:30, asleep by 9. I settled in on their couch with my psychology textbook, figuring I'd get some studying done while the house stayed quiet. Around 10 o'clock, my phone started buzzing with calls from Mr. Hendricks. When I answered, he sounded panicked and out of breath. Mrs. Hendricks had gone into labor suddenly. Her water broke during dinner, and they were rushing to the hospital. The baby wasn't due for another 2 weeks, but sometimes these things happened early. He apologized over and over for the situation, said they'd tried calling his sister to come pick me up, but she was out of town for the holiday weekend. "Ashley, I'm really sorry about this," he said, and I could hear car doors slamming in the background. "I left $100 on the kitchen counter for you. I know it's late, but would you be okay walking home tonight? I can't leave Sarah right now, and Emma's sound asleep anyway." I told him not to worry about it, that I'd figure something out. Honestly, I was more concerned about Mrs. Hendricks and the baby than getting home. $100 was way more than my usual rate, and the walk wasn't impossible, just longer than I'd prefer at night. Mr. Hendricks mentioned the cemetery shortcut before hanging up, said it would save me about 30 minutes compared to taking the main road all the way around. I'd walked through Hillside Cemetery plenty of times during the day when I was younger. It had a well-maintained path right through the middle with those little solar lights marking the way. After making sure Emma was still sleeping soundly, I grabbed my pepper spray from my purse and checked that my phone was fully charged. The cemetery route made sense, it was well lit enough, and I'd done that walk in daylight many times before. The main road would take me over an hour, winding all the way around the mountain, and honestly, I wasn't thrilled about walking along those narrow curves in the dark with no shoulder to speak of. The November night was cold but clear when I stepped outside. There was a full moon that made everything bright enough to see without straining my eyes. I could make out the cemetery gates about a quarter mile down the hill, and those little solar lights were glowing along the path like tiny blue stars. It actually looked kind of pretty from a distance, peaceful even. I zipped up my jacket, turned on my phone's flashlight just in case, and started walking down the gravel driveway toward the cemetery entrance. Hillside Cemetery was old. Some of the graves dated back to the 1800s when this area was first settled. My great-grandmother was buried there, along with a lot of other families who'd lived in these mountains for generations. During the day, it felt more like a park than anything scary. People would walk their dogs through there sometimes, and kids would cut through on their way to school. The maintenance crew kept it nice, with the grass trimmed and the older headstones cleaned up. At night, though, it had a different feel to it. Not necessarily bad, just different. I reached the cemetery gates around 10:15. They were old wrought iron, probably installed decades ago, but they stayed open 24 hours since people used the path as a legitimate shortcut. The solar lights created a clear trail that curved between the headstones, following what used to be an old logging road before the cemetery expanded. I could see all the way to the exit gate on the other side, maybe a quarter mile straight through. The whole walk would take 10 minutes, 15 at most. About halfway through the cemetery, I started hearing footsteps behind me. At first, I figured it was just the echo of my own steps bouncing off the headstones, but when I slowed down, the footsteps slowed down too. When I stopped completely to listen, they stopped exactly when I did. That's when I realized something was following me, matching my pace perfectly. I turned around, shining my phone light back along the path, but I couldn't see anything except rows of headstones casting long shadows in the moonlight. "Hello?" I called out, thinking maybe someone else was walking through, and just being cautious about approaching a stranger at night. My voice echoed off the marble and granite, but nobody answered back. Just silence, and the sound of my own heart starting to beat faster. I started walking again, this time a little quicker, and sure enough, the footsteps resumed behind me. Heavy footsteps, like boots on gravel, keeping the exact same rhythm as mine. Every time I sped up, they sped up. Every time I slowed down, they matched that too. It was like someone was deliberately mimicking my movements, staying just far enough behind that I couldn't get a clear look at them. "Is someone there?" I called out again, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can hear you walking." Nothing. Just that same perfect echo of my footsteps, always staying about the same distance behind me no matter how I changed my pace. I was getting genuinely scared now, my hands starting to shake as I held my phone. I thought about calling 911, but what would I tell them? That someone was walking in a public cemetery at night? That I heard footsteps I couldn't explain? I decided to make a run for it. The exit gate was only about 100 yards ahead, and once I got to the main road, there'd be streetlights and the occasional car passing by. I broke into a jog, my footsteps crunching loud on the gravel path, and immediately heard the footsteps behind me break into a run too. Not just matching my pace anymore, actually chasing me. I looked back over my shoulder and saw something that made my blood freeze. There was a figure about 50 feet behind me, tall and dark, moving between the headstones with an odd, jerky gait. I couldn't make out any details in the shadows, just this wrong-looking shape that seemed too tall and too thin to be a normal person. It was keeping pace with me perfectly, never gaining or losing ground, just maintaining that exact same distance, like it was tethered to me somehow. I sprinted toward the cemetery exit, my lungs burning in the cold air, hearing what sounded like heavy breathing right behind my ear, even though I knew the figure was still yards away. My phone light was bouncing everywhere as I ran, casting wild shadows that made every headstone look like it was moving. The exit gate seemed to take forever to reach, like the cemetery was stretching out longer than it should have been. Finally, I burst through the gates and onto the main road, spinning around to see what had been chasing me. The cemetery path was empty. No figure, no footsteps, just the peaceful rows of headstones glowing softly under the solar lights. I stood there panting, feeling ridiculous and embarrassed. Obviously, I'd spooked myself over nothing, let my imagination run wild in a perfectly normal cemetery at night. I caught my breath and started laughing a little. The way you do when you realize you've been scared of your own shadow. My heart was still racing, but the main road felt safe and normal. I could see streetlights in the distance marking the way back to town, and I felt silly for panicking over what was probably just the echo of my own footsteps and some tricks of light and shadow. I'd made it maybe 20 yards down the road when I heard Emma's voice calling from inside the cemetery. "Ashley, Ashley, help me." I stopped dead in my tracks. That was definitely Emma's voice, high and scared, crying out for help from somewhere back among the headstones. But Emma was safe at home with her parents at the hospital. I'd watched Mr. Hendricks carry his wife to the car myself. There was no way Emma could be in the cemetery. No way at all. "Ashley, please." The voice came again. Definitely Emma, sobbing and terrified. Someone's chasing me. I'm hiding behind Grandpa's grave. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this was impossible, that Emma was tucked safely in her bed miles away while her parents dealt with the new baby. But that was her voice, clear as day, and she sounded genuinely scared. What if something had happened at the hospital? What if someone had taken her? What if she'd somehow gotten confused and wandered off? Against every instinct telling me to keep walking toward town, I turned around and went back through the cemetery gates. I followed Emma's voice calling for help, moving deeper into the cemetery than I'd gone before, past the main path into the older sections, where the headstones were larger and more elaborate. "Emma, where are you?" I called out, shining my phone light between the monuments. "Over here, Ashley, behind the big angel statue." I found her crouched behind a large granite monument topped with a carved angel, just like she'd said. She was wearing the same pink pajamas I'd tucked her into bed in, and her face was streaked with tears. She looked up at me with those big brown eyes, shaking and scared. "Emma, sweetie, what are you doing here?" I knelt down beside her, my mind racing to make sense of the situation. "How did you get here? Where are your parents?" The man said, "Mommy and Daddy got hurt," she whispered, fresh tears streaming down her face. "He said they were in an accident, and I had to come find you. He brought me here, but then he started chasing me, so I hid." "What man?" I asked, but Emma just pointed behind me with a trembling finger. I turned around and saw him standing about 10 feet away, the tall figure from before, except now I could see him clearly in the moonlight. He was wearing dark clothes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and his face was hidden in shadow, even though the moon was bright enough to illuminate everything else around us. Something about his proportions was wrong. Too tall, too thin. Like someone had stretched a person out beyond normal human limits. "She belongs here now," he said in a voice that sounded like grinding stone. "All the children who walk through here belong to us." That's when I noticed Emma's hand in mine was ice cold. Not just cold from the November air, cold like she'd been outside for hours, like the cold was coming from inside her. Her skin had a grayish tint that I hadn't noticed before, and when I looked closer at her face, her eyes seemed flat and empty despite the tears. "Emma," I whispered, "how long have you been out here?" She smiled up at me then, and her teeth were black and rotting, her breath smelling like old earth and decay. "I've been waiting for you, Ashley. We've all been waiting." I scrambled backward, finally understanding what was happening. The real Emma was safe at home. This thing wearing her face had been using her voice to lure me back into the cemetery, had been calling for help in a voice I trusted completely, and I'd walked right into its trap. More figures were rising from behind the headstones now, tall and wrong-looking like the first one, all reaching toward us with arms that seemed too long for their bodies. The thing that looked like Emma was changing, its face shifting and melting like wax, the pink pajamas hanging loose on a frame that was stretching and distorting. I grabbed what was left of the Emma thing and ran toward the gates, but the body in my arms was getting heavier and harder to carry. I could feel it decomposing as I held it, the flesh turning gray and starting to fall away in chunks. By the time I reached the main road, I was carrying nothing but dust and fragments of bone that crumbled through my fingers. I collapsed at the roadside, staring at my empty hands while cars drove past without stopping. The few drivers that passed looked right through me like I wasn't even there. I tried calling 911, but my phone had no signal, despite showing full bars just minutes before. I tried flagging down a passing truck, but the driver didn't even slow down. I walked home in a daze, my mind trying to process what had just happened. When I finally got back to my dorm, I immediately called the hospital to check on Emma and her family. The nurse told me that Emma Hendricks was fine, that she'd stayed with her grandmother during her parents' hospital visit. The new baby had been born healthy at 11:30 p.m. AT, a little girl they named Grace. But I'd been in the cemetery with something wearing Emma's face at 11:30. I'd been carrying a decomposing child back to the road while the real Emma was safely tucked in at her grandmother's house. I never babysat for the Hendricks family again. Told them I was too busy with school, which was partly true. But really, I couldn't look at Emma the same way after that night. Every time I saw her, I remembered the feeling of cold, gray flesh crumbling in my hands, remembered those black teeth and empty eyes. I still have nightmares about carrying dead children out of cemeteries. Sometimes in the dreams, it's Emma, sometimes it's other kids I don't recognize, but it's always the same feeling of something heavy and wrong in my arms, something that doesn't belong in the world of the living. I'm 28 now, working as a teacher myself, and I live in the city where there aren't any old mountain cemeteries to cut through. I don't babysit anymore, and I don't take shortcuts through graveyards no matter how much time they might save. Some paths aren't worth walking, no matter how well lit they seem. To this day, I still don't know what those things were or what they wanted with Emma, but I know they're still out there in Hillside Cemetery, waiting for the next person who thinks a shortcut through the dead is worth the risk. Looking back now, I realize that whatever was in that cemetery had been watching the Hendricks family, learning their voices and routines, waiting for the right opportunity. It knew about Emma's grandfather's grave, knew how to mimic her voice perfectly, knew exactly what would make me come back and look for her. I still wonder sometimes if I actually saved anything that night, or if I just got lucky enough to make it out alive. But I never went back to find out, and I never will. I'm 35 years old, and I've been driving for Uber for about 3 years now, mostly working the overnight shifts because that's where the real money is. Between my wife Sarah and our 2 kids, we need every dollar I can bring in. My day job doing maintenance at the hospital barely covers rent, so those late-night rides, drunk college kids, airport runs, emergency hospital trips, they keep the lights on. I'd gotten pretty comfortable with the weird side of driving nights. You see everything when you're out there from midnight to 6 a.m. People at their lowest points, their most desperate moments, their strangest behavior. But I'd never had anything happen like what went down on November 30th. That was a Tuesday night, or I guess technically Wednesday morning, and it had been dead slow. I'm talking 1 ride in 3 hours slow. I was parked outside the 24-hour sheets on Highway 9, scrolling through my phone, when the app finally pinged. The request came through at 2:17 a.m. Pickup at Mercy General Hospital, destination Riverside Cemetery. 25-minute drive up into the mountains, which meant decent money if they actually showed up. Hospital runs are usually family emergencies. Someone lost a loved one, needed to get home, or had to rush back for visiting hours. The cemetery destination was weird for 3 a.m., but grief makes people do strange things. I'd driven plenty of people to say goodbye at odd hours. I'd been working Mercy General pickups for years because of my day job there, knew all the security guards, most of the night shift nurses. The hospital sits at the edge of town where the foothills start climbing toward the Blue Ridge. It's an old building, built in the 1942, with additions tacked on over the decades that never quite match. During the day, it bustles with activity, but at night it feels hollow. Just skeleton crews keeping watch over the sick and dying. Riverside Cemetery was about as far up into the mountains as you could drive on a real road. The old families around here had been burying their dead there for over a century. It sat on a ridge overlooking the valley, surrounded by thick woods that had grown up wild since the logging operations pulled out in the 1980s. During the day it was peaceful, almost beautiful. At night, well, I'd never been there at night before this. I knew the route well enough. Up Highway 52 through the valley, then winding mountain roads that got narrower and more treacherous the higher you climbed. In good weather, it was a pleasant drive. In November, with the fog that rolls in after midnight, it could be downright dangerous. But I needed the money, and a fare that far out usually meant a good tip from someone grateful to find a ride. The drive to the hospital took about 10 minutes through empty streets. Our town pretty much rolls up the sidewalks after 10 p.m., except for the gas stations and the 24-hour diner that serves truckers heading through to bigger cities. Most of the storefronts downtown still have the same families running them that started the businesses 50 years ago. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, at least in theory. In practice, there are plenty of folks living back in the hollows and up on the ridges that keep to themselves. When I pulled up to the hospital's main entrance, I saw a woman standing by the curb near the emergency department. She looked to be in her 40s, average height, wearing a dark coat that seemed too heavy for the mild November weather we'd been having. Her hair was pulled back, and she stood perfectly still, not checking her phone or looking around like most people waiting for rides do, just standing there, staring straight ahead. I rolled down my window. "You the ride to Riverside Cemetery?" She nodded and got in the back seat without saying anything. That wasn't unusual. People dealing with death often aren't in a talking mood. She gave me the cemetery address in a soft voice, confirming the destination. I input it into my GPS, even though I knew the way. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, figuring she'd lost someone at the hospital that night and needed to visit the grave or make arrangements. "Thank you," she replied quietly. "I just need to tell him goodbye." That made sense. I'd driven plenty of grieving relatives over the years. Sometimes people need to visit a gravesite right away, can't wait for morning. Grief doesn't follow normal schedules. I pulled away from the hospital and headed up toward the mountains. The night was clear when we started, but as we climbed higher, fog began rolling in from the valleys. It's common up there. Warm air from the day meets cold mountain air at night creates these thick banks of mist that can reduce visibility to maybe 20 feet. My passenger sat perfectly still in the back seat. I glanced in the rearview mirror a few times during the drive, and she never moved. Not shifting around, not checking her phone, not even seeming to breathe heavily. She just stared straight ahead at the back of my seat. It struck me as odd, but people grieve in different ways. Some folks talk your ear off, need to tell you about their loved one. Others shut down completely. The road up to Riverside Cemetery winds through dense forest that's been there longer than any of the families buried in those graves. During the day, you can see through the trees to the valleys below, but at night, it's just black walls on either side of the narrow asphalt. The fog made it worse, reducing my headlights to maybe 15 feet of visibility. I had to slow down to about 20 miles per hour, taking the curves carefully. These mountain roads don't have guardrails in a lot of places, just steep drops into darkness. I'd heard too many stories about cars going off those curves, not being found for days or weeks. The fog was thick enough that I could barely see the yellow lines. "Weather's getting pretty rough up here," I said, trying to make conversation and maybe ease the tension I was feeling. Something about the silence was getting to me. She didn't respond. When I looked in the mirror again, she was still staring straight ahead, hadn't moved an inch since getting in the car. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. I couldn't see her chest rising and falling. For a solid minute of watching in the mirror between watching the road, I saw no signs that she was breathing. I told myself I was being paranoid. The fog, the late hour, the creepy mountain road, it was all getting to me. People breathe quietly sometimes, especially when they're in shock or deep grief. I focused on the driving and tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. We finally reached the cemetery gates around 2:45 a.m. Riverside Cemetery sits on a flat stretch of land carved out of the ridge, surrounded by a wrought iron fence that's probably 8 feet tall. The gates were locked with heavy chains and a padlock, like they always are after sunset. There's no caretaker living on site, no way for visitors to get in after hours. I pulled up to the gates and put the car in park. "Looks like they're locked up for the night. I can wait here while you visit, or maybe we could come back in the morning?" "No need," she said in that same soft voice. "I'll find my own way back." She opened the door and got out, walking toward the gates without paying the fare or saying goodbye. The ride was showing $31.50 on my app, and I wasn't about to eat that cost. "Hey, excuse me," I called after her. "You need to pay for the ride." She just kept walking toward the gates, moving through the fog like she knew exactly where she was going. I got out of the car and followed her, pulling out my phone to show her the fare amount. But when I looked up from my phone, she was on the other side of the gates, inside the cemetery. I stopped dead in my tracks. The gates were still chained shut, padlock in place. There was no gap in the fence that I could see, no way she could have climbed over that quickly. The fog was thick, but not thick enough to hide someone climbing an 8-foot iron fence. "How did you?" I started to call out, but my voice trailed off. She was walking deeper into the cemetery, disappearing between the old headstones and monuments. I could just make out her dark coat moving through the mist. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to figure out what I'd just seen. Maybe there was a section of fence I couldn't see from the road, some maintenance entrance or gap that locals knew about. These old cemeteries sometimes have multiple access points. I decided to cut my losses and head back down the mountain. $30 wasn't worth standing around in a foggy graveyard at 3 a.m. I got back in my car and pulled out my phone to mark the ride as complete, but when I opened the app, there was no record of the trip. No pickup from Mercy General, no destination logged, no passenger named in my ride history. But I clearly remembered getting the notification, picking her up, driving her up here. The whole thing was right there in my memory. I started the car and began driving back down the mountain, trying to make sense of what had happened. That's when my phone chimed with a new ride request. Same pickup location, Mercy General Hospital. Same destination, Riverside Cemetery. Same passenger name, Margaret Chen. The timestamp on the request showed 2:17 a.m., the exact same time as the original pickup. I declined the ride and kept driving, but the request came through again 5 minutes later. Same details, same timestamp, like the app was stuck in some kind of loop. I pulled over and restarted the app, but the requests kept coming through. Margaret Chen, Mercy General to Riverside Cemetery, 2:17 a.m. That's when I looked in my rearview mirror and nearly drove off the mountain. She was sitting in my back seat again. Same woman, same dark coat, same position, staring straight ahead, like she'd never gotten out of the car at all. I whipped around to look directly at the back seat, and she was definitely there, solid and real as anything. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking. "We're back at the cemetery. You got out already." She turned to look at me, and that's when I saw her face clearly for the first time. Her skin had a grayish pallor, like old newspaper, and her eyes were completely black, not just dark brown or dilated pupils, solid black from edge to edge, like looking into empty sockets. "I need to go back to the hospital," she said in that same soft voice. "There's been an accident. I need to tell them I'm sorry." My hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The power locks weren't responding to anything. Not the button on my door, not the central control, nothing. The engine started itself, and the car began moving back down the mountain road. "I was driving drunk," she continued, still in that calm, matter-of-fact tone. "Hit a family of 4 on Highway 52, 3 kids in the back seat. I've been trying to get back to the hospital to apologize for 15 years. The car was driving itself, following the same route we'd taken up the mountain, but I wasn't touching the steering wheel. My foot wasn't on the gas pedal. The speedometer showed us moving at exactly 25 miles per hour, the same speed I'd driven on the way up. "You're going to help me make this right," she said. "You're going to help me get back to where I need to be." I tried everything, pulling the steering wheel, hitting the brakes, even yanking the keys out of the ignition. Nothing worked. The car kept moving down the mountain road, through the fog, heading back toward Mercy General. Every few minutes she would repeat parts of her story. About the drunk driving, about the family she killed, about needing to apologize. Each time she told it, she looked worse. Her skin became more gray, more translucent. Her hair started falling out in patches. Her clothes began to look torn and stained, like she'd been in a car accident. But her voice never changed, always that same, soft, polite tone. We reached the hospital, and the car stopped at the same pickup spot where I'd found her. She got out and walked toward the emergency entrance. I tried to follow her, but I was stuck in the driver's seat like I was glued there. Through the windows, I could see her talking to the security guard at the entrance, but he didn't seem to see or hear her. Then she came back to the car, and we started the whole loop again. Hospital to cemetery, cemetery to hospital. Each trip taking exactly the same amount of time, following exactly the same route. She would tell me about the accident, about the family she killed, about needing to apologize, each time looking more and more like a corpse. I lost count of how many times we made that drive. My phone showed the same time, 2:17 a.m., no matter how long we'd been driving. The gas gauge never moved. Nothing outside the car seemed to change. Same fog, same empty roads, same darkness. The only thing that changed was her appearance. By what felt like the 10th or 11th loop, I could see through her skin to the car seat behind her. Her eyes had sunk deep into her skull. Her voice had become a whisper, but she kept telling the same story, kept insisting that I was going to help her make things right. I started praying, something I hadn't done since I was a kid. Started talking to my wife and kids in my head, telling them I was sorry, that I loved them. I thought this was it. I was going to be trapped in this loop forever, driving a dead woman through the mountains until my own body gave out. Then, during what must have been the 15th or 20th trip, my phone died. The GPS screen went black, the radio cut out, and suddenly I could feel the steering wheel in my hands again. I yanked it hard to the right and slammed on the brakes. The car skidded off the road and down a shallow embankment, coming to rest against a tree about 20 feet from the asphalt. When I looked up, she was gone. The back seat was empty. My phone was dead, but the car's clock showed 6:23 a.m. I sat there shaking for I don't know how long before I heard voices calling my name. A state trooper and a volunteer firefighter had found my car. They said a trucker had called in seeing skid marks and a vehicle off the road. According to them, I'd been unconscious behind the wheel for several hours. They took me to Mercy General, the same hospital where this whole thing started. The doctor said I'd probably fallen asleep at the wheel, maybe had a small seizure or some kind of medical episode. No signs of drugs or alcohol, no indication of anything other than exhaustion. They wanted to keep me for observation, but I signed myself out as soon as I could walk steady. I never told anyone the real story. How could I? Who would believe that a dead woman had trapped me in some kind of time loop, forcing me to relive her final night over and over? I told Sarah I'd gotten tired and went off the road, which was close enough to what the police report said. But I did some research when I got home. Margaret Chen, 43 years old, died in a single-car accident on November 30th, 2008. She'd been drinking and lost control on Highway 52, crashed into a tree about 2 miles from the hospital. The news articles said she'd been at a company party, was driving home around 2:15 a.m. when it happened. There was no mention of her hitting any family, no other vehicles involved. But there was a small note in one of the follow-up articles about how her accident occurred on the 15-year anniversary of a hit-and-run that killed the Morrison family, parents and 3 children, on that same stretch of highway. The drunk driver in that case was never found. I quit driving for Uber the next day, told Sarah I wanted to focus on finding a better day job, maybe get some training for something that pays more than hospital maintenance. The truth is, I can't get in a car at night anymore without my hands shaking. Even during the day, I avoid Highway 52 completely. Sometimes I wonder if Margaret Chen is still out there, still looking for someone to help her make things right, still trying to apologize for something she did 15 years before she died. I hope she finds peace, but I hope I never see her again. I work double shifts at the hospital now instead of driving nights. The money's not as good, but at least I sleep in my own bed every night. And I never, ever take ride requests after midnight. I'm 31 years old and I've been delivering pizza for Tony's Pizza Palace for about 2 years now. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills, and I know these mountain roads like the back of my hand. I've driven every street and back road in 3 counties, from the main highway down in the valley all the way up to the old mining camps that are mostly abandoned now. Most nights I'm done by 10 p.m., but sometimes we get those late calls from people who work second shift or folks who just lost track of time. November 23rd started like any other Friday night. We'd been busy all evening with the usual crowd. College kids, families getting dinner, the bar crowd wanting something to soak up their beer. I was actually looking forward to heading home early when the phone rang at 11:30. Tony answered it, wrote down the order, and handed me the ticket with a grin. "Jake, you're gonna love this one," he said. 2 large pepperonis, way up in the mountains. Customer already paid with a credit card and left a $20 tip. I looked at the address and didn't recognize it, which was weird. Like I said, I know these roads. But the GPS showed it was about 30 minutes up into the hills. And $47 plus a $20 tip was worth the drive, even if it meant getting home an hour later than planned. Tony had already started the pizzas, so I grabbed a Coke and waited. The thing about delivering pizza in these mountains is that you get to know people. You know which houses always tip well, which ones never turn their porch lights on, which driveways you can't get up when it's been raining. You know the regulars who order every Friday night and the folks who only call on special occasions. After 2 years, you develop a mental map of not just where everything is, but who lives there and what to expect. This address was completely new to me, which should have been my first red flag. In a small community like ours, you don't just miss an entire house, especially not one that's apparently far enough out that it takes 30 minutes to reach. But the money was good and I needed it. My rent was due Monday, and I was cutting it close this month. The fog started rolling in just as I loaded the pizzas into my car. It's not unusual for November. The mountains create these weird weather patterns where you can have clear skies in town and thick fog just a few miles up the ridge. I'd driven in worse conditions, so I wasn't worried. My Honda Civic isn't much to look at, but it's reliable, and it handles these winding roads better than you'd expect. I headed out of town on Route 9, following the GPS directions. The road was familiar for the first 10 minutes. Past the gas station, over the bridge, up through the section where all the newer houses are built. But then the GPS told me to turn left onto a road I'd never noticed before. It was paved, but narrow, with no center line and no reflectors on the sides. The kind of road that probably started as a logging trail back in the day and got paved later when someone decided to build up there. As I climbed higher into the mountains, the fog got thicker. It wasn't the light, wispy kind that you can see through. This was heavy, almost solid-looking fog that seemed to press against my windshield. I had to slow down to about 20 miles per hour because I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The GPS kept saying, recalculating route, and then going blank for a few seconds before picking up again. About 20 minutes into the drive, I realized I had no cell phone signal. That wasn't unusual up in the mountains. There are plenty of dead zones where the towers can't reach. But it was another little thing that added to the weirdness of the whole situation. I was basically driving blind, following a GPS that kept glitching, to deliver pizza to an address I'd never seen before. The road kept getting narrower and more winding. What had started as a decent 2-lane road became more like a wide driveway, with trees crowding in on both sides. I could hear branches scraping against my car as I took some of the tighter turns. The fog was so thick now that my headlights barely penetrated it. It was like driving through cotton. After what felt like forever, but was probably only about 45 minutes total, I finally saw lights ahead through the fog. They were warm, yellowish lights, like the kind you get from old-style incandescent bulbs. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a small cabin, maybe a vacation home or hunting lodge. There were several cars parked in front of it, which made sense if someone was having a party or family gathering. But as I pulled into what I guess was the driveway, something struck me as odd. All the cars were the same, not just the same model, but identical, black sedans, maybe Ford Tauruses or something similar. They were parked in perfect lines, like someone had used a ruler to space them out evenly. I counted 8 or 9 of them, all facing the same direction, all parked with military precision. I sat in my car for a minute, engine running, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who has 8 identical black cars? Maybe it was some kind of business meeting, or maybe they were fleet vehicles from a company, but it felt wrong somehow. The cars all looked clean and well-maintained, but the license plates were weird. Some of them looked old, like really old, with the small yellow numbers on blue backgrounds that I remembered from when I was a kid. Others were from different states entirely. The cabin itself looked normal enough. Single story, wood siding, small front porch with a couple of chairs. All the windows had curtains or cloth covering them, so I couldn't see inside, but that wasn't unusual. People liked their privacy up in the mountains. There was smoke coming from the chimney, and I could hear voices inside, multiple people talking at once. I grabbed the pizza bags and walked up to the front door. The porch boards creaked under my feet, which was normal for an older cabin. What wasn't normal was how quiet everything else was. No insects, no night sounds, no wind in the trees. Just dead silence, except for the voices inside and my own footsteps. I knocked on the door, and the voices inside immediately stopped. Complete silence for maybe 10 seconds. Then I heard movement, like several people getting up from chairs at the same time. Footsteps approached the door, but they sounded weird, too synchronized, like people marching in formation. The door opened, and a man in a dark business suit stood there, smiling at me. That was my first real something's wrong moment. Who wears a business suit to a cabin in the mountains? And his smile was too wide, showing too many teeth, like he was trying really hard to look friendly but didn't quite understand how smiles were supposed to work. "Pizza delivery," I said, holding up the insulated bags. "Perfect timing," he replied. "We've been waiting for you." Behind him, I could see into the cabin's main room. There were more people sitting around a large wooden table, maybe 10 or 12 of them. They were all wearing identical dark suits, and they were all looking at me with that same too-wide smile. The weird thing was, they all looked exactly alike. Not just similar, exactly alike. Same face, same hair, same build. Like someone had made copies of the same person. Come in," the man at the door said, stepping aside and gesturing for me to enter. "We need to discuss payment." Something in my gut told me not to go inside. But I'd already been paid, so I wasn't sure what there was to discuss. And these people were clearly expecting me. Maybe it was some kind of corporate retreat or business meeting, and they all worked for the same company. That could explain the identical cars and the formal clothes, even if it didn't explain why they all looked like twins. I stepped inside and immediately felt like something was wrong. The air was thick and hard to breathe, with a metallic taste that reminded me of blood. The room was lit by old-fashioned oil lamps instead of electric lights, which cast weird shadows on the walls. And it was too warm, not cozy warm, but oppressive, like being in a furnace. All the people around the table were staring at me now, and I could see they really were identical. Same face, same expression, same unnatural smile showing too many teeth. They all sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table, not moving or blinking. "We don't eat pizza," one of them said, without moving his lips much. "We eat other things," said another one, and they all laughed at exactly the same time. In exactly the same way. It sounded like a recording being played through multiple speakers. That's when I noticed what was under the table. Bones. Human bones. Picked clean and arranged in neat piles. Rib bones, leg bones. What looked like pieces of skull. And they were fresh. Some still had bits of meat clinging to them. I tried to back toward the door, but it had somehow closed behind me without me hearing it. The identical men stood up from the table in perfect unison, still smiling those horrible smiles. "You brought us exactly what we ordered," they all said at once, their voices creating this weird harmony that made my skin crawl. That's when I understood. They hadn't ordered pizza, they'd ordered a pizza delivery driver, they'd ordered me. I broke for the nearest window, not caring about the cloth covering it or what might be on the other side. I hit it shoulder first and crashed through the glass, landing hard on the ground outside. Behind me, I could hear them laughing, that same synchronized laugh, but multiplied, like there were dozens of them now instead of just 12. I scrambled to my feet and ran for my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition. All around me, the identical black sedans were starting up at exactly the same time, engines turning over in perfect harmony. In the brief glimpse I got through their windshields, I could see more of the identical men, all wearing those same dark suits, all with those same horrible smiles. I threw my car in reverse and gunned it, not caring about staying on the narrow driveway. Branches scraped against my windows, and I could hear my bumper hitting something, but I didn't slow down. In my rearview mirror, I watched the black cars pulling out of their parking spaces, all moving in the same smooth, coordinated way. The drive down the mountain was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every time I checked my mirrors, there were more black cars behind me. They never got closer, but they never fell back either. They maintained exactly the same distance, like they were connected by invisible strings. And there were more of them than there should have been. I counted at least 15 cars at one point, even though I'd only seen 8 or 9 at the cabin. When I finally reached the main highway, something strange happened. All the cars stopped at exactly the same spot, like they'd hit an invisible wall. They just sat there, engines idling, while I kept driving toward town. I looked back once and saw all the headlights lined up in a perfect row across the road, but they weren't following anymore. I drove straight back to Tony's Pizza Palace, my hands still shaking, my shirt soaked with sweat. Tony took one look at me and asked what the hell had happened. I tried to explain, but it sounded crazy even to me. So I just told him the customers weren't home, and I couldn't find the address. But when Tony checked our computer system, there was no record of the order. No phone call at 11:30, no credit card payment, no delivery ticket. According to the system, I'd been sitting in the parking lot for the past 6 hours, not moving. The security cameras showed my car in the same spot all night, with me sitting inside it, completely motionless. Tony thought I'd fallen asleep and had some kind of vivid nightmare. He sent me home and told me to get some rest. But I knew what I'd experienced was real. The scratches on my car from the tree branches were real. The cut on my shoulder from breaking through the window was real. The smell of that metallic air was still in my nose. The next day, I drove back up that mountain road in broad daylight, trying to find the cabin. I thought maybe I could prove to myself what had happened, maybe find some evidence. But when I reached the spot where I thought the turnoff should be, there was nothing. Just unbroken forest on both sides of the road. No driveway, no tire tracks, no sign that anyone had ever built anything up there. But the ground was soft from recent rain, and I could see tire tracks in the mud. dozens of them, all identical tread patterns, arranged in those same perfect lines I'd seen at the cabin. They led from the road about 50 feet into the trees, then just stopped, like the cars had vanished into thin air. I still work at Tony's Pizza Palace. It's been 8 months now since that night, and I've never told anyone the full story. But sometimes we get orders from that same address, showing up in our computer system just like any normal delivery order. When that happens, I always find an excuse not to take it. I tell Tony I'm not feeling well, or my car's having trouble, or I need to handle another delivery first. Other drivers have taken those orders. They always come back confused, saying they couldn't find the address or the customers weren't home. But they always come back, and the orders keep coming, usually on foggy nights, usually around 11:30 p.m. I don't know what those things were or what they wanted with me. Maybe they're still up there, waiting for the next delivery driver who's willing to take the risk for a good tip. Maybe there's something that's always been in these mountains, something that learned to mimic human behavior just well enough to lure people into their trap. All I know is that I'm never driving up into those mountains alone at night again. And if you're ever tempted to take a delivery order to an address you don't recognize, especially one with a tip that seems too good to be true, maybe think twice about it. Some money isn't worth earning. Because sometimes the customers aren't ordering food. Sometimes they're ordering something else entirely. I was 28 when I took that delivery job at Save-A-Lot, and honestly, it wasn't much to write home about. Just stocking shelves, running register, helping folks carry their groceries out to beat-up pickups and old sedans. But after 4 years working there, I knew pretty much everyone who came through those doors regular-like. Small-town grocery stores are funny that way. You become part of people's routines, whether you want to or not. Mrs. Henderson was one of those customers you couldn't help but notice. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, she'd shuffle in with her little canvas purse and head straight for the floral section. Never bought much else, maybe some crackers or a can of soup, but she always left with a bouquet of flowers. White roses when they had them, carnations when they didn't. The girl who worked the flower counter told me Mrs. Henderson had been doing this for years, taking those flowers out to Peaceful Rest Cemetery where her husband was buried. Vietnam vet, died young, and she'd been visiting his grave every single week for 15 years. I'd always thought it was sweet, you know? The kind of love story that makes you believe in something bigger than yourself. Mrs. Henderson would smile and nod when I'd carry her flowers to the car, and sometimes she'd tell me little stories about her James. How he used to bring her wildflowers when they were courting, how he proposed with a daisy ring because he couldn't afford anything else. Real gentle soul, she was. The kind of old lady who still wore lipstick to the grocery store and called everyone honey or dear. That's why I didn't think twice about saying yes when she called the store that Tuesday in November. I was getting ready to clock out around 5:30 when my manager handed me the phone. Mrs. Henderson was on the other end, voice shaky and tired, explaining she was feeling too poorly to drive. Some kind of chest cold that had her all worn down. She asked if there was any way at all, that someone could take flowers out to James for her that evening. Said she'd never missed a Tuesday in 15 years, and wasn't about to start now. "I'll pay you $50 for the trouble," she said, and I could hear the desperation creeping into her voice. I know it's asking a lot, but James, he'll be expecting them. $50 was more than I made in a whole day after taxes, and besides, Mrs. Henderson had always been nothing but kind to me. How hard could it be to drive 30 minutes out to a cemetery and leave some flowers on a grave? I told her I'd be happy to help, and she gave me detailed directions to find grave C 47 inches, section 3. Her voice got stronger when she was giving directions, like she'd made that trip so many times she could navigate there with her eyes closed. I picked up her usual white roses, a dozen of them, wrapped in that green tissue paper, and headed out around 6 p.m. November in the mountains means it gets dark early, and by the time I was driving through the winding back roads toward Peaceful Rest, thick gray clouds were settling in overhead like a heavy blanket. The cemetery was further out than I'd expected, tucked back in a holler between two steep hills covered in bare hardwood trees. The kind of place that probably looked peaceful enough in daylight but had that lonesome feel once the sun started going down. The cemetery was bigger than I'd imagined, too. Hundreds of graves spread across several terraced sections carved into the hillsides, with gravel roads winding between them like a maze. Some of the headstones looked old as dirt, weathered granite and crumbling marble dating back to the 1800s. Others were newer, modern flat markers with photographs embedded in the stone. I found Section 3 easily enough by following the small numbered signs. But as I parked my car and got out with Mrs. Henderson's flowers, something felt off about the whole place. The air was too still. That was the first thing I noticed. No wind moving through the trees, no rustle of dried leaves, no birds making their evening noise before settling in for the night. Just absolute quiet, thick and heavy, like the air itself had weight to it. Even though it wasn't quite winter yet, there should have been some kind of sound, squirrels maybe, or crows heading to roost, but there was nothing. Just my own footsteps crunching on the gravel and the sound of my breathing. I found James Henderson's grave without much trouble. Row C, plot 47. Just like Mrs. Henderson had said, simple granite headstone that read, James Henderson, beloved husband, 1943 to 1968. Below that, someone had carved, until we meet again. I set the white roses against the headstone, taking a moment to straighten them the way I figured Mrs. Henderson would have done. The flowers looked bright and clean against the dark stone, and for a second, I felt good about doing this small kindness for a lonely old woman. That's when I heard the breathing. At first, I thought it might be my own breath fogging in the cold air, but this was different. Heavier, wet, like someone with damaged lungs trying to pull air through fluid. I stopped moving and listened, and the breathing continued. A slow, labored rhythm that definitely wasn't coming from me. I looked around the cemetery, but didn't see anyone else. Just rows of headstones stretching off in all directions, getting lost in the gathering darkness. When I started walking back toward my car, that's when I noticed the footprints. Fresh impressions in the soft, damp ground that definitely hadn't been there when I'd walked in. The dirt near James Henderson's grave was churned up like something had been moving around, pacing maybe, while I'd been arranging the flowers. But these prints were all wrong. Too long and too narrow for human feet, with deep gouges at the front end that looked like claw marks. I followed the trail with my phone's flashlight, my heart starting to pound as I realized the prints led away from James Henderson's grave toward the older section of the cemetery. The beam from my phone wasn't very strong, but I could see the impressions getting deeper and wider as they went, like whatever had made them was getting bigger with each step, or maybe walking heavier, putting more weight down. The trail led me up a small rise toward the back of the cemetery, where the oldest graves were clustered under a stand of ancient oak trees. This section felt different from the rest, wilder, less maintained. Headstones were tilted at odd angles, some so weathered you couldn't read the names anymore. Vines had grown up around several of them, and the grass was patchy and thin, like the ground underneath couldn't quite support healthy growth. That's where I found what I can only call a feeding ground. There was a circular clearing in the older section where the grass was stained dark, almost black in the fading light. Scattered all around this space were bones, animal bones mostly, but arranged in deliberate patterns like someone had been organizing them. Ribs laid out in neat rows, leg bones stacked in small pyramids, skulls lined up facing the center of the clearing. And in the middle of it all was a pile of flowers, dozens and dozens of bouquets in various stages of decay, from fresh arrangements that still had color to brown, rotting stems that crumbled at the slightest touch. The smell hit me then. Not just the sickly sweet stench of rotting flowers, but something else underneath it. Wet fur and musk, like a dog that had been rolling in something dead. The kind of smell that gets in your nose and stays there, making you feel sick and dizzy. I was staring at this horrible display, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when I heard a low growling from the tree line. Not just one source, but several, like a pack of something circling around the clearing. I swung my flashlight toward the sound and caught glimpses of pale gray fur moving between the trees, always staying just outside the reach of my light. Whatever was out there was big. The shadows they cast were wrong, too tall, moving upright instead of on all fours like normal animals would. And their eyes reflected green when my flashlight beam swept past them, but the eyes were too high off the ground, like they were standing on their hind legs. I started backing away from the clearing, but the growling got louder and more agitated, like they didn't want me to leave. The sounds were coming from all around now, and I could hear heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, getting closer. When something howled behind me, not like a wolf or a dog, but like a person screaming in pain, I broke into a run. I stumbled and slipped on the uneven ground, trying to find my way back to where I'd parked my car. The cemetery suddenly seemed much bigger than it had before, like the paths had rearranged themselves while I wasn't looking. I could hear them following me, whatever they were, crashing through the dead leaves and undergrowth, breathing hard, making sounds that were almost like talking, but not quite human enough to understand. When I finally made it to my car and got the headlights on, I saw them clearly for the first time. 3 creatures standing at the edge of the light, just watching me. They were upright like men, but covered in matted gray fur that hung in clumps from their bodies. Their faces were the worst part, a horrible mix of human and animal features. Long snouts full of sharp teeth, but human eyes that looked intelligent, hungry, like they were thinking about me, making plans. The one in the middle was holding something in its clawed hands. Mrs. Henderson's white roses. The flowers I'd just placed on her husband's grave. I drove away as fast as I could, checking my mirrors constantly to make sure they weren't following. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the car on the road, and I kept expecting to see those green eyes reflecting in my headlights. But the road stayed empty, and gradually the normal sounds of night started coming back. Wind in the trees, an owl hooting somewhere in the distance, the normal things that should have been there all along. The next day, I drove to Mrs. Henderson's house to return her $50. I couldn't take money for what had happened, couldn't tell her that something had stolen her flowers and was keeping them in some kind of horrible shrine. But when I knocked on her door, nobody answered. The mailbox was overflowing with newspapers and letters, and the neighbor who came out to see who was making noise told me Mrs. Henderson had been in the hospital for weeks. "Sweet old lady," the neighbor said, "but she's been real confused lately. Keeps talking about feeding the hungry ones at the cemetery. Dementia, you know how it is." I called the hospital to check on her condition, thinking maybe I could visit, bring her some flowers of her own. The nurse I talked to confirmed she'd been there for over a month with severe dementia, but what she said next made my blood run cold. She keeps asking us to take flowers to feed something. Says they'll be waiting for them, and if we don't bring them, they'll come looking. Poor dear gets so agitated about it. That's when I understood what had really been happening all those years. Mrs. Henderson hadn't been visiting her husband's grave out of love and remembrance. She'd been feeding those things, training them to expect flowers every Tuesday. And now that she couldn't make her deliveries anymore, they were waiting. Getting hungrier. Getting bolder. I never went back to that cemetery, and I quit my job at Save-A-Lot 2 weeks later. Told my manager I was moving back to the city to be closer to family, which wasn't exactly true, but wasn't exactly a lie either. I just couldn't stay in that town knowing what was out there, knowing those things were still waiting for someone to bring them flowers. Sometimes, I wonder what happened when they realized no one was coming anymore. Whether they stayed in that cemetery, getting more desperate, or whether they started looking for food somewhere else. I try not to think about it too much, but every time I drive past a cemetery now, any cemetery, I make sure to keep my doors locked and my windows up. And I never, ever buy flowers for graves anymore. Some traditions are better left to die. I was 28 when I started driving nights for Uber, back in 2019. Had to after the mine closed and took half the jobs in our hauler with it. My daddy worked those same tunnels for 37 years before black lung got him, and I figured I'd follow that path too. But the coal's mostly gone now, and what's left ain't worth the digging. So there I was, driving strangers around in a 10-year-old Honda that burned oil and had a check engine light that'd been on since Obama was president. Sarah, that's my wife, she wasn't happy about the night work. Said it worried her. Me picking up people she'd never met, going places she couldn't follow. But we had Medicaid paperwork saying our boy needed specialist appointments down in Charleston, and those don't pay for themselves. The overnight runs paid better anyway. Less competition, higher surge rates when the bars closed. Most of my rides started or ended at Mercy General. That hospital's been squatting on the hillside since before I was born, and it's where everybody in 3 counties comes to die. I'd gotten used to the rhythm of it, picking up tired nurses at shift change, family members who'd been holding vigil, the occasional drunk who thought the ER could sober them up faster than time. But I'd never gotten a call to take somebody to Riverside Cemetery. Not at 2:47 inches the morning on November 30th. Not to the old section, where they buried folks back when my great-granddaddy was still clearing trees off this mountain. I almost didn't take the ride. Something about it felt wrong from the minute the notification popped up on my phone. The pickup was listed as patient discharge, which was normal enough, but the destination made me pause. Who goes to a cemetery before dawn? Especially Riverside, that place has been nothing but trouble since they built it back in the 1800s. Local folks have stories about that ground, things that happened there during the smallpox outbreak of 1918. But $26 for a 20-minute drive was $26, and I needed every fare I could get. The woman was waiting by the hospital's emergency entrance when I pulled up, standing perfectly still under the buzzing fluorescent light. She was maybe 40, wearing what looked like a black dress from another era, long sleeves, high neck, fabric that seemed too heavy for November. When she got in the back seat, she didn't say hello or give me the destination. Just sat there, breathing so quietly, I wondered if she was breathing at all. "Riverside Cemetery," she said finally, and her voice had an accent I couldn't place. Not from around here, but not from anywhere else I could name either. The old section. I pulled away from the hospital and headed up into the mountains. The road to Riverside winds through some of the darkest hollows in this part of West Virginia, places where cell towers can't reach and GPS loses its way. During the day, it's pretty enough thick stands of oak and maple that turn gorgeous in October. But at night, those same trees press against the road like they're trying to reclaim it. We'd been driving maybe 10 minutes when I glanced in my rearview mirror to check on my passenger. What I saw there stopped my heart for a beat. The reflection showed an old man in a military uniform, the kind they wore in World War II. He was staring right back at me with eyes that were completely black, no whites at all. I jerked my head around to look at the back seat directly. The woman was still there, same black dress, same still posture. But when I looked back at the mirror, it was the old man again, and now he was smiling with too many teeth. "Keep your eyes on the road," the woman said, but the voice coming from her mouth was the old man's voice, rough and dry like autumn leaves. My hands started shaking on the steering wheel. I've lived in these mountains my whole life, heard all the stories the old-timers tell about things that don't belong in the world of the living. But I never believed them until that moment, sitting in my car with something that wore faces like I wear shirts. "You're not real," I whispered, more to myself than to whatever was in my back seat. "Reality is negotiable," it replied, and now the voice was different again, a young girl's voice, sweet and high. "Especially in November, especially here, where the soil remembers everything it's swallowed." I wanted to pull over, to run, to do anything except keep driving toward that cemetery. But something was wrong with my car. The steering wheel felt locked in place, turning only enough to follow the curves of the mountain road. The speedometer was stuck at 35 miles per hour. When I tried to brake, my foot went through the pedal like it was made of smoke. In the mirror, faces kept changing. An elderly woman with hollowed cheeks, a child with smallpox scars covering his skin, a young mother still wearing a hospital gown, her hair matted with something dark. Each face stared at me with those same black eyes, and each one smiled with teeth that belonged in a predator's mouth. "We've been waiting," they said in unison, their voices layering over each other like a choir of the dead. "Been waiting since the ground thawed this spring. November is our month, when the veil gets thin and the old roads remember where they used to lead." The trees were wrong now. Instead of the familiar oaks and maples I'd grown up among, twisted shapes pressed against the car windows. Their branches moved without wind, reaching toward us like arthritic fingers. The road itself had changed too. Instead of cracked asphalt, we were driving on packed dirt that squelched under the tires like wet clay. "Where are you taking me?" I managed to ask. "Home," the thing said, and now it sounded like my daddy, speaking in the voice he'd had before the black lung took most of his words. "Taking you home to Riverside, where your family's been waiting." That's when I understood. This wasn't just about the cemetery. This was about the ground itself, the soil that had been drinking death for more than a century. Every body buried there, every life that had ended in these mountains, they were all part of whatever was sitting behind me, wearing their faces when it needed to walk among the living. The car lurched to a stop at the cemetery gates, and I realized we'd arrived without me noticing the last few miles of the journey. time had slipped sideways, the way it does in nightmares when you can't quite remember how you got from one place to another. "Thank you for the ride," the thing said politely, using a voice I recognized but couldn't place. "There's no charge for family." I turned around to face it directly, and what I saw in that back seat will follow me to my own grave. It wasn't wearing a face at all anymore. Just smooth gray skin stretched over a skull that was the wrong shape, with eye sockets that went too deep and a mouth that opened onto darkness deeper than any cave I'd ever explored. "You'll be back," it said without moving its lips, the words forming inside my head like my own thoughts. "They always come back to visit family." I blinked, and the back seat was empty. The car doors were still closed, windows still rolled up, but there was no sign that anyone had been there at all, except for the smell wet earth and old flowers and something else underneath it all, something sweet and rotten that made my stomach clench. I tried to start the car, and this time it turned over immediately. But when I looked at the GPS on my phone, it showed me sitting in the middle of an empty field 20 miles from where I thought I was. No cemetery, no mountain road, just an old pasture that hadn't been used for farming in decades. It took me 3 hours to find a road I recognized, and by the time I got home, the sun was coming up behind the mountains. Sarah was waiting in the kitchen with coffee and worried eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, trying to make it sound like a joke. I never told her what happened that night. Never told anyone, until now. But things changed after that. The Uber app stopped working on my phone every time I tried to log in. It would crash immediately. Found work at the lumber yard instead. Day shift, solid ground under my feet. But November came around again the next year, and the year after that. And every November, right around the 30th, my phone would buzz with a ride request. Same pickup location, same destination, same $26 fare that never got charged to any credit card. I stopped answering my phone in November. The thing is, I started recognizing faces around town. Not the stolen ones, the real ones. People I'd gone to school with, folks from church, neighbors I'd known my whole life. But now I could see something different in their eyes sometimes, especially in November when the light gets thin and the shadows grow long. Some of them had been to Riverside Cemetery. Some of them had taken that ride with something that wears faces like masks. And some of them, I realized with a chill that went deeper than any winter morning, hadn't made it back at all. Last November, I drove past the cemetery during the day, just to prove to myself it was still there. It was. But there were fresh graves in the old section, graves that hadn't been there before. And the names on some of the newer headstones belonged to people I'd seen around town just a few weeks earlier. People who'd been perfectly healthy, people who'd had no reason to die. But they'd answered their phones in November. I don't drive for rideshare anymore. Don't take calls from numbers I don't recognize. And every year when November 30th rolls around, I make sure to be somewhere else visiting Sarah's sister down in North Carolina, or taking the kids camping in Virginia, anywhere but here in these mountains where the soil remembers everything and the dead have learned to use our phones. Because I know now what the old-timers always knew, what they tried to tell us in their stories about things that walk between the worlds. Some roads don't lead where you think they're going. Some passengers aren't going anywhere at all, they're just trying to take you with them. And in November, when the veil gets thin and the mountains remember their oldest secrets, sometimes they succeed. The cemetery's still there, if you know how to find it, but I'd recommend you don't go looking, especially not at night, especially not in November, especially not if your phone starts ringing with ride requests you never signed up for.